"Never park again here," Karen shouted after I refused to give up my reserved parking spot. I live in a massive apartment complex on the edge of the city where parking isn't just an inconvenience, it is an absolute daily nightmare. It is one of those sprawling cookie-cutter places built in the late 90s where the developers cared infinitely more about maximizing the number of units they could lease than figuring out where all those paying tenants were actually going to put their vehicles. If you do not have a reserved spot, you are basically playing the Hunger Games every single night after 6 p.m. Cars are wedged against bright yellow fire hydrants, parked half up on the landscaping grass, or abandoned out on the main county road where you run a 50-50 risk of getting a parking ticket or getting sideswiped by a drunk driver in the dark. When I signed my lease 3 years ago, I took one look at the parking lot at dusk and saw the writing on the wall. I made sure to talk to the leasing agent and pay the extra $75 a month for a covered, reserved spot right next to my building entrance. That is $900 a year. To a lot of people, that is grocery money or a substantial chunk of a car payment. To me, it is the price of my physical sanity. I work as a kitchen manager at a busy, high-volume restaurant downtown. My typical shift starts at 2 in the afternoon and doesn't even come close to ending until the last line cook finishes scrubbing down the flat-top grill and the final keg is locked up in the walk-in cooler. And that means I rarely get home before 1 a.m. By the time I finally pull off the highway and into my complex, I am entirely dead to the world. My lower back aches constantly, my feet throb inside my heavy non-slip work shoes, and my clothes are permanently infused with the heavy, inescapable smell of old fryer grease, charred meat, and industrial floor sanitizer. That reserved spot is not a luxury for me, it is a strict necessity. I am usually exhausted, my brain is completely fried, and I just want to turn off the ignition, walk the 30 feet to my staircase, and get inside my apartment without walking half a mile through a dark, unlit overflow lot, hoping I don't step in dog crap or get mugged in the shadows. Everything was fine. For 3 solid years, it was perfectly fine. I paid my rent, I parked in my spot, and I went to sleep. Then, like about 2 months ago, a new tenant moved into the unit directly above mine. Her name is Brenda. Brenda didn't just move in, she arrived. Moving day involved a massive team of professional movers sweating through their shirts while she stood on the sidewalk drinking iced coffee, barking orders, and pointing fingers. She is in her late 40s, dresses like she is permanently on her way to a country club brunch, wears excessive amounts of chunky turquoise and silver jewelry that clanks loudly every time she moves her arms, and she drives a pristine white Mercedes SUV. Not just a standard SUV, one of those massive, armored-looking things with a custom grille that costs more than my entire apartment is worth. She treats that car like a literal child. I watched her wipe a single water spot off the driver's side mirror with a specialized microfiber cloth her second day here. The complex assigns parking based strictly on availability. Since Brenda moved in late in the leasing cycle, her officially assigned spot was in the uncovered section on the far south edge of the property. It is right near the massive green community dumpsters and directly under a giant, overgrown pine tree that drops heavy sap all year round. I guess that was not good enough for her. The first time it happened, it was a random Tuesday. I pulled into the lot at 1:30 a.m. I had just worked a 14-hour shift because 2 of my prep cooks had called out sick right before the dinner rush. I was bone tired, running on caffeine and adrenaline that had worn off 3 hours ago, and I made the familiar turn into the carport area, coasting toward my building, only to find her Mercedes sitting dead center in my spot. The little white number 42 painted on the asphalt was completely swallowed up and covered by her oversized, chrome-trimmed front bumper. I hit the brakes and just stared at it through my windshield. My brain literally could not process it at first. You know that heavy sinking feeling when you are so physically exhausted that an unexpected obstacle just makes you want to put your forehead on the steering wheel and give up? That was me. I sat there idling for a full 5 minutes. I was too tired to deal with calling a tow truck dispatcher, waiting an hour in the freezing cold for them to arrive, and signing release paperwork while standing in the parking lot. So I put my car in reverse. He drove out of the complex, parked out on the main street, and walked 10 minutes back to my building in the freezing wind. My thin chef's jacket did absolutely nothing against the cold. Before I left for work the next morning, I walked over to the Mercedes. I ripped a page out of a small notebook I keep in my glove box and left a polite note on her windshield. Standard neighborly stuff. It just said that the spot was reserved and paid for monthly, and asked her to please use her own assigned spot going forward. I tucked it under her heavy wiper blade, assumed she just hadn't understood the complex's numbering system, and thought that would be the end of it. People make mistakes. But 3 days later, it was Friday night. I got off work at 2 a.m. I pulled in, exhausted all over again, and found her parked there again. Same car, same spot. A same perfect diagonal alignment right over my number 42. This time, my sympathy was completely gone. I did not leave a polite note. I grabbed a thick black marker from my center console, tore a piece of stiff cardboard off a box I had in my back seat, and wrote a very clear, unfiltered message telling her that if she parked in my leased spot one more time, she would be towed at her own expense. I jammed it hard under her wiper blade, parked out on the street again, and walked back in the dark. The next morning, I was taking my trash out to the main dumpsters. It was around 10 a.m. I was in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, carrying 2 heavy, leaking trash bags. I heard the frantic clanking of heavy jewelry before I even saw her. Brenda marched right up to me on the concrete sidewalk. She was holding my piece of cardboard by the very corner, holding it away from her body like it was a piece of rotting garbage. She stopped 3 feet away from me, her eyes narrowed. She asked if I was the one leaving threatening messages on her vehicle. Her voice was incredibly shrill. I set the trash bags down on the concrete. I told her I was not threatening anyone, I was just informing her of the strict rules regarding the parking spot that I pay real money for every single month. She looked me up and down. Her eyes dragged over my messy hair, my stained shirt, and stopped on my worn-out black, non-slip work sneakers. She actually sneered. It wasn't subtle. She adjusted her designer purse on her shoulder and said that a real gentleman would offer his covered spot to a woman, especially since her car was clearly much nicer and more expensive than my 10-year-old Toyota Camry. She stood there and actually said out loud that the tree sap near the dumpsters was ruining the expensive clear coat on her paint job, and that my car was already a lost cause anyway. anyway, so it wouldn't make a difference if I parked out there. I literally laughed in her face. It wasn't an angry laugh. It was just pure, exhausted disbelief. I told her that my car might be a piece of junk, but it was going to be parked in the piece of junk spot that I pay $75 a month for. I told her the conversation was over. She turned bright red. The veins in her neck physically popped out. She stomped her foot on the pavement like a toddler and said she was going to speak to the leasing office about my aggressive and intimidating behavior. Then I picked up my trash bags, looked at her, and told her to go right ahead. I didn't wait for her to spin a story. I called the property manager myself that afternoon before my kitchen shift started. His name is Dave. I have lived there for years, paid my rent on the first of the month every single time, and never once called in a noise complaint or caused a problem for management. When Dave answered the phone and I explained the situation, he sighed heavily into the receiver. It was a tired, defeated sound. He told me Brenda had already called him screaming for 20 minutes about how she felt unsafe living near me and how the complex needed to accommodate her vehicle. Dave was completely, entirely out of patience, and he told me flat out that I had full authorization to tow anyone parked in my spot without going through the front office first. He didn't want to mediate it. He even gave me the direct cell phone number of the overnight dispatcher for the towing company they contract with. I saved it in my phone right then. For exactly 1 week, things were quiet. I pulled into spot 42 every night after work, and it was empty. I thought she had finally realized she couldn't bully her way into free covered parking. Then came the Friday of the long holiday weekend. The restaurant was an absolute war zone from the minute we unlocked the front doors. We had a line wrapping around the building by 5 p.m. The kitchen was pushing 100 degrees. The flat-top grill was completely covered in steaks. And the ticket printer was spitting out orders in a continuous, deafening stream. I was working a brutal double shift, meant to be there from 10 a.m. until 2 a.m. I managed to get a brief lull in the chaos around 4 p.m. and stepped out to the alley to breathe. That is when I patted my pockets and realized I had forgotten my daily medication at home on my bathroom counter. It is a prescription I have to take at the same time every day, or I get blinding migraines and severe nausea. There was absolutely no way I was going to survive a Friday holiday dinner rush without it. I calculated the time. I had exactly 45 minutes to drive back to the complex, run up to my apartment, grab the pills, and get back to the kitchen before the real dinner wave hit. I drove fast. I was sweating, stressed, and watching the clock on my dashboard. I pulled into the complex, swung my Camry around the corner toward my building, and my blood immediately boiled. The pristine white Mercedes was sitting in my spot again, but this time she hadn't just parked. She had parked diagonally, lazily cutting across the painted yellow lines, taking up my entire spot and encroaching heavily onto the adjacent concrete walkway that leads to the building's stairs. It was a massive, arrogant middle finger. I looked at the clock. I did not have time to deal with this. I did not have time to put my car in reverse, drive out to the street, hunt for a parallel spot, run a quarter-mile back to the building, grab my pills, and run all the way back. I was already running out of time, so I just pulled my Camry directly behind her Mercedes. I pulled up close, really close. Oh, my front bumper was maybe 3 inches from her rear license plate. I was completely perpendicular to her, blocking her in completely. She couldn't back out without driving straight through my engine block. I threw my hazard lights on, turned off the ignition, locked my doors, and ran upstairs to my apartment. I figured I would be exactly 3 minutes. I would run in, take my pill, come back down, move my car, and deal with calling the tow truck once I was safely back at work. I unlocked my door, ran into the bathroom, and grabbed my pill bottle. I was inside for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard the horn. It wasn't a quick, polite tap. Someone was laying their entire body weight on their car horn down in the parking lot. It was a continuous, obnoxious, and blaring blast of noise that echoed loudly off the stucco walls of the apartment building. I dry swallowed my pill, grabbed my keys, locked my apartment door, and walked down the stairs. I didn't run. I took my time. When I reached the first floor landing, I saw Brenda. She was leaning entirely out the driver's side window of her Mercedes, screaming at the top of her lungs at my empty Camry. When she saw me walking out of the stairwell, she stopped honking, threw her heavy car door open, and completely lost her mind. She started shrieking that I was illegally detaining her. She was waving her arms wildly, her chunky bracelets clanking together like a wind chime in a hurricane. She screamed that she had a very important, expensive hair appointment across town, and that if she missed it, she was going to sue me for the non-refundable deposit and the emotional distress. I didn't yell back. I just stood there at the bottom of the stairs, completely calm, pulled out my phone, and dialed the direct number Dave had given me for the tow truck company. I spoke clearly. I gave the dispatcher the exact address of the complex, the spot number 42, and the make, model, and color of her car. I looked right at Brenda as I told the dispatcher that the owner of the vehicle was currently present, blocking a pedestrian walkway and highly hostile. The dispatcher didn't even pause. He said they had a truck dropping off a repo 2 streets over and that a driver would be there in exactly 5 minutes. Brenda heard me. She saw me put the phone back in my pocket. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that she was calling the police because I was threatening her safety and holding her hostage. She pulled out her own phone, dramatically punched in the numbers, and actually dialed 911. She put it on speakerphone. I could hear the emergency operator answer. Brenda instantly put on a frantic, breathless voice, claiming an aggressive man had trapped her in a parking lot and she feared for her life. I didn't react. I just leaned my back against the side of my Camry, crossed my arms, and waited. I pulled my phone out again and texted my boss that I was going to be about 10 minutes late because of a sudden emergency at my apartment. My boss just texted back a thumbs up. The tow truck arrived before the police did. It was a massive, battered Ford flatbed truck. It roared into the lot, the air brakes hissing, the reverse alarm beeping loudly as it swung around. The driver backed up to the rear of her Mercedes with practiced, terrifying efficiency. He didn't care that my car was close. He just angled his rig perfectly to slide the metal lifting claws under her rear tires. When Brenda saw the flashing amber lights of the tow truck, she went absolutely ballistic. She dropped her phone on the pavement, ran straight up to the tow operator who had just stepped out of the cab and started physically hitting his arm. She was shrieking, commanding him to stop, screaming that he could not touch her luxury vehicle. The driver was a massive guy. He had a thick beard, hands the size of dinner plates, and looked like a man man who dealt with screaming, irrational people for a living and had run out of patience a decade ago. But he did not even blink when she hit him. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at her and told her in a dead, flat tone that if she touched him one more time, he would drop the cables and have her arrested for battery. He turned his back on her completely and continued hooking the thick metal chains to the underside of her car. That is exactly when a local police cruiser rolled slowly into the lot, its blue lights flashing silently against the beige apartment walls. Brenda abandoned the tow truck driver and immediately ran to the officer as he stepped out of his vehicle. She put on the most pathetic, theatrical, fake crying act I have ever seen in my life. She was practically hyperventilating, pointing frantically at me, telling the officer that I was trying to steal her car, that I had violently trapped her in the parking lot, and that she was a victim. The officer gently held up a hand to stop her from grabbing his uniform. He walked over to where I was leaning against my car. I did not say a single word. I didn't try to argue or explain my side of the story. I just opened the resident portal app on my smartphone. I pulled up my digital lease agreement, scrolled down to the parking addendum, and held the screen out to the officer. It clearly showed my name, my apartment number, and reserved parking space 42 in bold text. Then, without speaking, I pointed down at the pavement. Sticking out right from under the front tire of her Mercedes was the giant white-painted number 42. The officer looked at my phone. He looked down at the pavement. Then he turned slowly and looked at Brenda. Her fake tears stopped instantly. The crying evaporated. She realized she was caught in a lie, but instead of backing down, she tried to pivot. She started stammering, telling the officer that the leasing office told her she could park there because the spot by the dumpsters was fundamentally unsafe for a woman and that her car was too nice to be parked under a tree. The officer was entirely unfazed. He hooked his thumbs into his utility belt. He told her in a tired, firm voice that this was a civil matter between residents, but since she was undeniably parked in a privately leased spot that belonged to me, the tow was completely legal and justified. He told her she needed to step away from the tow truck immediately so the driver could finish his job. She completely melted down. It was a total loss of control. She demanded the officer arrest the tow truck driver for touching her car. She demanded he arrest me for trapping her. She demanded to speak to the chief of police, claiming discrimination. The officer actually had to drop his hand onto his heavy radio, step directly toward her, and warn her that if she did not step back onto the grass right that second, she would be physically detained and put in handcuffs for interfering with a lawful tow. The threat of handcuffs finally worked. Brenda froze, her face pale, and took 3 slow steps back onto the grass, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. The tow truck driver finished securing the rear tires of her Mercedes. He engaged the heavy hydraulic winch. With a loud, groaning scrape of metal, the pristine white SUV was hoisted backward and locked into place. The driver wiped his greasy hands on his pants, walked over to where Brenda was standing on the grass, and then held out a crushed business card. He didn't smile. He just told her that the impound lot was 20 miles away out on the county road, that the initial impound fee was $350, and that they absolutely only accepted cash. She didn't take the card. She just watched in stunned, absolute silence as her pristine white SUV got hauled away, the tow truck turning the corner and disappearing out of the complex. I got back into my Camry, backed up a few feet, pulled cleanly into my newly vacated reserved spot just to savor the feeling, and then backed out and drove back to work feeling better than I had in weeks. The dinner rush didn't even bother me that night. Every night now, when I finally get home from my exhausting kitchen shifts at 1 a.m., spot 42 is empty and waiting for me. I pull in, turn off the engine, and walk to my stairs. And every single time I do, I look over toward the far south edge of the property. Sitting all the way down by the dumpsters, permanently parked underneath that massive, sap-leaking pine tree, is a white Mercedes, right where it belongs. I thought the tow would be the end of it. I really did. When you cost someone nearly $400 and force them to take a humiliating Uber ride to a dirt impound lot 20 miles out of town, normal people learn their lesson. They retreat. But Brenda isn't normal. Brenda is a woman who has spent her entire life weaponizing her entitlement, and I had just publicly stripped it from her. She didn't learn a lesson. She just changed tactics. Remember, she lives in the unit directly above mine. The petty retaliation started exactly 2 days after the tow. My schedule is brutally consistent. I unlock my front door around 1:15 a.m. I heat up whatever leftover family meal I brought home from the kitchen in a plastic deli container, eat in silence on my couch, take a shower, and get into bed by 2:30 a.m. On Tuesday night, just as my head hit the pillow, the ceiling above my bed violently shuddered. Thud. It sounded like a dropped bowling ball hitting the floorboards. I waited in the dark. 10 seconds later. Thud. Then came the distinct rhythmic sound of hard-heeled shoes pacing back and forth directly over my bedroom. I just stared at the ceiling. I was too exhausted to even be angry yet. I put in silicone earplugs, pulled the heavy pillow over my head, and eventually passed out. The next night, it wasn't footsteps. It was the vacuum cleaner. At 2:45 a.m., the grinding, a vibrating hum of a heavy upright vacuum rolling back and forth over the thin apartment carpet right above my face. She bumped the baseboards hard over and over again. Wham! Vrr! Wham! I didn't grab a broom and bang on the ceiling. I didn't go upstairs and knock on her door. That is exactly what she wanted. She wanted a confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could call the police and play the victim all over again. Instead, I reached over to my nightstand, grabbed my phone, and hit record on the voice memo app. I set it on the mattress. I recorded 20 straight minutes of her aggressively vacuuming a clean floor in the middle of the night. I did this for 4 days, pacing, dropping heavy objects, vacuuming, dragging dining chairs across the linoleum kitchen floor. I recorded all of it. I logged the exact dates and times in a notepad. On Monday morning, my 1 day off, I walked down to the leasing office. Dave was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a spreadsheet on his monitor. When he looked up and saw me, he instantly rubbed his temples. "Please tell me you didn't tow her again," he said. "No," I said, sitting down in the chair opposite him. "I didn't." I pulled out my phone and played the recordings. I showed him the timestamps. 2:30 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 2:50 a.m. Dave listened for 2 minutes before holding up his hand to stop it. "She's retaliating," I told him plainly. "She knows my work schedule. I'm not asking you to evict her today, Dave, but I want it in my tenant file. I want a formal noise violation issued, paper trail file. Dave nodded heavily. He printed out a formal warning notice, signed it, and told me he would tape it to her door himself that afternoon. The noise stopped that night, but Brenda wasn't done. My apartment has a small ground-floor concrete patio that sits directly beneath her second-floor balcony. I keep a cheap plastic chair out there and sometimes sit in the dark for 10 minutes after a shift just to let the adrenaline drain out of my system before going inside. 3 days after the noise violation, I stepped out onto my patio, and my non-slip shoes crunched on the concrete. I turned on my phone flashlight. The entire slab was covered in wet, foul-smelling potting soil, dead geranium leaves, and cigarette butts. Brenda didn't even smoke. She had literally swept the filth off her balcony and dumped it directly onto my patio. The smell was disgusting, like stale ash and rotting roots, and I stood there in the cold night air. I looked up at the wooden slats of her balcony. I didn't yell. I didn't clean it up either. The next day, before my shift, I drove to the hardware store and spent $40 on a small, discreet Wi-Fi security camera. I mounted it in the upper corner of my patio, tucked tightly behind the gutter downspout where it was completely invisible unless you were actively looking for it. I angled the lens straight up at her balcony. I left the dirt and cigarette butts exactly where they were. I wanted her to think she had won. I wanted her to get bold. It took exactly 1 week. It was a Saturday night. I got home at my usual time. I parked in spot 42. I walked up to my patio and stopped. There was a massive and sticky puddle of dark liquid splattered across my plastic chair and pooling on the concrete. It smelled sharp and sweet, cheap red wine. She had poured an entire bottle of cheap red wine directly down through the slats of her balcony onto my patio. I smiled. I actually smiled. I walked inside, locked the door, and opened the camera app on my phone. I scrubbed back through the motion-activated footage. There it was, clear as day in the infrared night vision. At 11:45 p.m., Brenda's face peered over the edge of the railing. She looked around the empty courtyard to make sure no one was walking their dog. Then, her hand reached through the slats, holding a glass bottle, and she tipped it upside down. The liquid cascaded perfectly onto my patio below. She even shook the bottle to get the last drops out before retreating back inside. It was undeniable, high-definition proof of targeted vandalism and harassment. I didn't call Dave this time. I woke up at 9 a.m. the next morning, took a shower, and drove straight to the local police precinct. I walked up to the desk sergeant, explained that I was experiencing ongoing harassment and property damage from a neighbor in retaliation for a legal tow, and handed over a cheap flash drive. It had the video file, the audio recordings of the noise harassment, and a PDF copy of the formal warning Dave had issued her. The officer took my statement. He watched the video on his monitor. He shook his head in disgust. "We can send a unit over to issue a citation for vandalism and criminal mischief," he said, looking at me over his keyboard. "Do you want to press charges?" "Yes," I said without a second of hesitation. Absolutely." I went to work that afternoon. It was a Sunday, a relatively easy shift. I prepped the line, cooked the orders, and didn't think about Brenda once. I got home at 1 a.m. I parked in spot 42. As I walked past the dark, unlit overflow lot near the dumpsters, I noticed something missing. The pristine white Mercedes wasn't parked under the pine tree. I walked to my building. When I got to my door, I saw a piece of paper taped to the wood. It was from Dave. I unfolded it in the dim hallway light. It wasn't a note for me. It was a photocopy of a formal notice to quit, an eviction warning. Dave had attached a yellow sticky note to the front. "Cops showed up at 3 p.m. today, issued her 2 citations. She screamed at the officers in the courtyard and threw a potted plant at one of them. She was arrested for assaulting an officer. So the property management company is terminating her lease immediately due to criminal activity on the premises. She has 72 hours to clear out her unit." I read the sticky note 3 times. I let out a long, slow breath. I walked inside, threw my keys on the counter, and walked out onto my ruined, wine-stained patio. I sat down on the clean edge of the concrete, ignoring the sticky mess. I looked up at the empty balcony above me. There was no pacing, no dropping bowling balls, no vacuuming, just absolute perfect silence. 3 days later, a crew of professional movers showed up again. They didn't look happy, but Brenda wasn't there to bark orders at them. They quietly packed up her expensive furniture, loaded it into a truck, and drove away. I never saw her again. I don't know where she moved, and I genuinely don't care. When I spent my next day off scrubbing my patio with bleach and a wire brush until it was completely clean again. Life went back to normal. The kitchen stays hot, the tickets keep printing in a never-ending stream, and my back still aches every single night when I clock out. But when I pull into my complex at 1 a.m., completely dead to the world, I don't have to worry. I just coast toward my building, turn the steering wheel, and glide effortlessly into spot 42. I thought Brenda was the final boss of my parking nightmare. I really did. I thought the universe had handed me my one chaotic, stressful hurdle for the year. I had cleared it, and the reward was a year of unbothered, covered parking. I was wrong. Brenda wasn't the final boss. She was just the catalyst that blew my entire living situation wide open. And I had exactly 2 months of peace. 60 perfect quiet days of pulling into spot 42 at 1 a.m., turning off the engine, and walking 30 feet to my door. I even started sleeping better. My back pain dulled down from a constant stabbing ache to a manageable throb. I felt like a human being again. Then, on a Tuesday in late October, I walked up to my building and found a crisp white envelope taped to my door, along with every other door in my corridor. It wasn't from Dave. The letterhead at the top of the paper was a sleek, modern, geometric logo, Apex Residential Management. The letter was written in that cold, sterile corporate speak that uses a lot of words to deliver very bad news. It stated that our complex had been acquired by Apex Residential. Dave, the property manager who had been there for 6 years and actually treated people like humans, was no longer with the company. The leasing office would be closed for a week for administrative remodeling, but the third paragraph was the one that made my stomach physically drop. In an effort to ensure equitable access to community amenities for all residents, Apex Residential is restructuring the parking program. Effective November 1st, all assigned and reserved premium parking spaces will be permanently dissolved. The monthly $75 premium fee will be removed from your ledger. Instead, all residents will be subject to a flat $50 monthly community parking access fee. Parking will transition to a strictly first-come, first-served basis across the entire property. Any unauthorized numbers or reserved signage will be removed. I stood in the hallway and read it 3 times. Equitable access. That meant they wanted to squeeze $50 out of every single tenant in the complex instead of just the 50 of us who willingly paid the premium for a reserved spot. It was a massive cash grab, disguised as a community benefit. I walked into my apartment, unlocked my filing cabinet, and pulled out my original lease. I flipped to the back pages. There it was, clear as day. Parking Addendum A. Tenant is granted exclusive use of covered space 42 for the duration of the lease term. My lease wasn't up until June. They legally couldn't change the terms of a signed contract right in the middle of it without my consent. The next morning, I tried to call the office. And it went straight to a new automated answering service. I left a voicemail. I emailed the generic contact address at the bottom of the letter, attaching a scanned copy of my lease addendum, stating firmly that I did not consent to the change and expected spot 42 to remain mine until June. I got an automated reply stating they were experiencing high email volume. November 1st fell on a Friday. I worked my usual brutal double shift. We got crushed. I clocked out at 1:45 a.m., smelling heavily of garlic, fryer oil, and stale sweat. My legs felt like lead. I pulled into the complex, coasted toward my building, and my headlights hit the carport. Spot 42 was gone, not just occupied. The giant white number painted on the asphalt had been completely blacked out with a thick, messy layer of industrial tar. The metal reserved sign, bolted to the wooden beam above it, had been unscrewed and removed, and sitting dead center in what used to be my spot was a rusted, lifted Dodge Ram pickup truck. I put my car in park and just sat there. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion I felt in that moment is hard to describe. It wasn't boiling rage like I had with Brenda. It was a deep, heavy, crushing defeat. I had fought so hard for that stupid piece of concrete. I spent the next 20 minutes driving aimlessly around the complex. The lot was completely, dangerously full. Cars were parked on the grass, blocking the dumpsters, parked illegally in the fire lanes. I finally found a spot on the dirt shoulder of the main county road outside the complex gates. I locked my car, zipped up my jacket against the freezing wind. I then started the 15-minute walk back to my building in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, staring at my lease. When Monday morning rolled around, the office reopened. I didn't call. I didn't email. I walked down there at 9 a.m. sharp. The office had been entirely gutted. The warm beige walls were painted a stark hospital white. Dave's old wooden desk was gone, replaced by a sleek glass table. Sitting behind it was a woman in a sharp blazer, typing furiously on a laptop. Her nameplate read Sylvia, Regional Director. I walked in and laid my lease on the glass desk. I didn't yell. I kept my voice perfectly level. I pointed to the addendum and told her that they were in breach of contract. I told her I wanted my spot back. I wanted the tar removed, and I wanted my reserved sign replaced. Sylvia didn't even look up from her screen at first. When she finally did, she gave me a perfectly practiced, completely empty corporate smile. She told me that a change of ownership allowed for the restructuring of non-essential amenities. She used the phrase community standardization 3 times. She said my $75 fee had been canceled, so I was no longer paying for the spot, making my complaint moot. I told her I didn't want the fee canceled. I wanted to pay it. I told her the spot was a condition of my signing the lease in the first place. She leaned back in her expensive ergonomic chair. Her tone shifted from fake polite to strictly dismissive. She told me the decision was final and applied to the entire property. If I was unhappy with the new community standards, I was welcome to submit a 60-day notice to vacate and break my lease early, subject to a 2-month rent penalty, of course. She was daring me to leave. She wanted me to leave so she could renovate my unit and jack up the rent for the next guy. I'm not leaving, I told her, and I'm not paying the $50 general parking fee either. Sylvia smiled again. If you fail to pay the community access fee, your vehicle will not be registered in our new digital parking system. Any unregistered vehicle parked on the property is subject to immediate towing at the owner's expense. She had me boxed in. I walked out of the office. For a week, I lived like an absolute ghost. I parked on the dirt shoulder of the county road every single night. I walked in the freezing rain. My knees ached. My sleep schedule fell apart. And every night I walked past what used to be spot 42, and every night there was a different car parked there. I started paying close attention to the cars. Apex Residential had completely oversold the lot. It wasn't just crowded, it was structurally failing. To maximize that new $50 monthly fee, they were clearly handing out parking passes to anyone who asked, regardless of the physical capacity of the property. I did some quick math one night on my walk. I counted the total number of physical parking spots in my half of the complex. There were roughly 150 spots, but the sheer volume of cars wedged into every corner, parked along the red curbs, and stacked on the landscaping easily surpassed 250. That is when I remembered a conversation I had with my boss at the restaurant months ago when we had to restructure our dining room layout. He told me the fire marshal does not mess around with occupancy and access limits. It is the one city agency with absolute unchecked power to shut down a business on the spot. I went back to my apartment and got to work. I didn't complain to Sylvia again. I didn't write bad reviews online. I spent 3 hours looking up municipal fire codes for high-density residential properties. I found exactly what I was looking for under Section 503 of the International Fire Code, which our city had adopted. It mandates unobstructed fire apparatus access roads of a minimum width of 20 feet. It explicitly states that fire lanes cannot be obstructed by parked vehicles under any circumstances. Every night for the next 4 nights, when I got home from my shift at 1 a.m., I didn't just walk to my apartment. I walked the entire perimeter of the complex. I took out my phone and I took pictures. I photographed cars parked directly in front of the bright yellow fire hydrants. I photographed cars parked horizontally across the red-painted fire lanes that ringed the central courtyard. I photographed the main entrance gate, where cars were double parked so tightly that a standard sedan barely fit through, let alone a 50-foot fire engine. I made sure the timestamps and location data on the photos were turned on. I compiled a massive file. I printed out 40 high-resolution photos. I drafted a concise, factual 2-page letter detailing the exact dates, times, and locations of the obstructions. I stated that the new management company, Apex Residential, had deliberately restructured their parking program to oversell passes and resulting in systemic dangerous blockages of emergency access routes. I didn't mail it. On my next day off, I drove downtown to the city's central fire fire station and walked directly into the fire marshal's office. I handed the thick manila envelope to the deputy marshal at the front desk. I told him I was a resident at a massive complex on the edge of town, and I was genuinely concerned that if a fire broke out in the middle of the night, people were going to die because emergency vehicles physically could not access the buildings. The deputy opened the envelope. He looked at the first 3 pictures. His expression instantly went completely flat. He called another guy out from a back office. They both stood there, flipping through my photos of the blocked hydrants and choked access roads. When were these taken? The deputy asked. Every night this week, I said. Between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. That's when the lot is at maximum capacity. Leave your contact info, he said, tapping the photos against the desk. We'll look into it. I went to work. I didn't know if anything would actually happen. Bureaucracy moves slowly, if at all. But fire marshals don't play politics. It happened 3 days later. It was a Thursday night. I was working the line, deep in the weeds of a late dinner rush, when my phone started buzzing continuously in my pocket. I ignored it until my break. When I finally stepped out back and checked my screen, the complex's community group chat, which was usually dead, was exploding with messages. I scrolled up. Someone had posted a video. At 11:30 p.m., 2 massive city fire engines, a battalion chief's SUV, now and 3 local police cruisers had rolled up to the front gates of the complex. The battalion chief didn't even try to squeeze his SUV through the double-parked cars. He just parked sideways, blocking the entire entrance. The video showed 6 firefighters and 3 cops walking through the complex in the middle of the night with heavy-duty flashlights. They weren't fighting a fire. They were writing citations. They ticketed every single car parked in a red zone. They ticketed every car blocking a hydrant. And then, according to the chat, the fire marshal demanded the emergency after-hours contact for property management. They called Sylvia. They woke her up in the middle of the night and forced her to drive to the property. By the time I got home at 2 a.m., the fire engines were gone, but the aftermath was legendary. Oh, there were bright orange municipal citations tucked under the wipers of at least 60 cars. The next afternoon, my phone rang. It wasn't an unknown number. It was the direct line for the Apex Residential Leasing Office. I answered it. Hello, this is Sylvia, the voice on the other end said. She didn't sound corporate and polished anymore. She sounded stressed. Her voice was tight. I need you to come down to the office immediately. I'm prepping for a shift, I said calmly. I can come by on Monday. No, she snapped. Then she took a breath, forcing herself to calm down. Please, we need to have a meeting regarding your lease. Now. I turned the stove off, grabbed my keys, and walked down to the office. When I walked in, Sylvia wasn't behind her glass desk. She was pacing the floor. There was a man in a very expensive suit sitting on the couch. He introduced himself as the regional vice president for Apex. The fire marshal hadn't just written tickets to the residents. He had issued a massive, crippling fine directly to Apex Residential for systemic fire code violations and reckless endangerment. Furthermore, he had issued a binding order that the complex had to reduce its parking volume to match its legal capacity within 48 hours, or the city would start revoking their certificates of occupancy. They were bleeding money, and they were staring down a massive logistical nightmare. We are currently reviewing the implementation of our new parking strategy, the vice president said, his voice slick but nervous. It seems there were oversights. Yeah, I said, leaning against the doorframe. And you oversold the lot to make a quick buck and block the fire trucks. Sylvia glared at me, but the VP held up his hand. We are reinstating the reserved parking tier, he said quickly. We have to restrict general access to comply with the city mandate. We noticed in your file that you previously held a reserved spot and were vocal about its removal. I have a signed contract, I reminded him. Yes, the VP said smoothly, and we would like to honor it, effective immediately. In fact, to apologize for the disruption and any misunderstandings regarding the lease terms, we are willing to waive the $75 monthly fee for your spot for the remainder of your current lease. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were terrified I was going to organize a tenant lawsuit for breach of contract on top of their city fines. They wanted to buy my silence, and they wanted to do it fast. I looked at Sylvia. She was staring at the floor, her jaw clenched tight. Spot 42, I said. Spot 42, the VP agreed. We will have maintenance repaint the numbers and rehang the sign by the end of the day. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Make sure they use the thick reflective paint. The tar makes it hard to see. I walked out of the office and went to work. When I pulled into the complex at 1:30 a.m. that night, the lot was chaotic. Tow trucks were actively dragging away the lifted Dodge Ram and 3 other cars that had parked in the red zones. People were standing on the sidewalks, yelling. The Hunger Games had resumed, but this time, management was the one pulling the trigger. I didn't care. I drove past the chaos, coasted around the corner toward my building, and hit my brakes. There it was. The thick black tar had been power washed and scraped away. Fresh, brilliant white paint spelled out the number 42 on the asphalt. The metal reserved sign was bolted firmly back onto the wooden beam. The spot was completely empty. I put my Camry in drive, glided effortlessly into the space, and turned off the engine. The silence in the car was absolute. I grabbed my bag, locked my doors, and walked the 30 feet to my stairs. I haven't parked on the street since. That statement held true for exactly 3 months. November and December passed without a single incident. The white numbers on the asphalt stayed clean. The metal sign hung proudly above my hood. I fell into a rhythm of work, sleep, and unquestioned parking that felt like absolute luxury. Then came late January, and the city got hit with the worst winter storm we had seen in a decade. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. By the time my shift ended at 2 a.m., the temperature had dropped into the single digits, and there was a 1.5 feet of heavy, wet snow on the ground. The drive home took me 45 minutes instead of 15. My Camry's tires spun on the unplowed roads, the heater blasting but doing absolutely nothing against the freezing air leaking through the weather stripping. When I finally turned into the apartment complex, I knew immediately that Apex Residential had cut corners again. Instead of hiring a professional fleet to clear the massive property, they had clearly hired a single, cheap, independent contractor with a plow bolted to the front of a pickup truck. The main driving lanes were haphazardly cleared, but the contractor hadn't bothered to carefully navigate the tighter spaces. He had just driven his truck straight down the middle of the lanes, angling his plow blade to the side, pushing massive compacted walls of dirty snow and ice directly into the covered parking spots. Spot 42 was completely buried. There was a 4-foot-high solid wall wall of dense packed snow spanning the entire width of my spot. It looked like a glacier. I parked my car idling in the fire lane, staring at the snowbank. I was exhausted. My hands smelled like raw onions and bleach, but I knew if I didn't clear it now, the temperature was going to drop below zero by morning, and that snowbank would freeze into a solid block of concrete that wouldn't melt until April. I went up to my apartment, put on 2 extra layers of hoodies, found an old, cheap plastic snow shovel I kept in my hall closet, and went back downstairs. I spent 2 straight hours shoveling. It was agonizing, backbreaking work. The snow from the plow was incredibly heavy, mixed with road salt, mud, and gravel. My cheap shovel bent with every scoop. I sweat through my base layers, the freezing wind biting at my face every time I paused to catch my breath. I didn't just clear a path. I scraped that spot down to the bare painted asphalt. I tossed the snow onto the adjacent grass median, creating a massive pile well out of the way. By 4 a.m., spot 42 was completely empty and pristine. It was the only spot in the entire carport section that was perfectly clear. I pulled my Camry in, went upstairs, took a scalding hot shower, and passed out. The next day I drove to work. The roads were still a mess. The restaurant was understaffed because people couldn't commute, and I ended up working another brutal double shift. All day, the only thing keeping me going was the knowledge that my perfectly shoveled spot was waiting for me. I pulled into the complex at 1:30 a.m. Sitting dead center in my pristine, perfectly clear spot was a sleek black Audi A6. It wasn't poorly parked. It was perfectly centered. I hit the brakes and the tires slipped slightly on the icy road. I put the car in park and stepped out into the freezing air. I walked up to the Audi and shined my phone flashlight through the driver's side windshield. Hanging from the rear view mirror was a thick, glossy plastic placard. It had the geometric Apex Residential logo on it. Underneath, in bold red lettering, it read VIP/Regional Management, do not tow. Although I knew exactly whose car it was. I had seen Sylvia getting into it outside the leasing office a week prior. She had driven to the complex to inspect the snow removal, realized the cheap contractor had completely botched the job, and instead of parking in the unplowed overflow lot and walking through the snow in her expensive boots, she had driven around until she found the one spot that some idiot had spent 2 hours clearing by hand. My spot. She didn't care about the reserved sign. She thought the placard made her legally untouchable on Apex property. I pulled out my phone. Apex had terminated the contract with Dave's old towing company months ago. There was a new metal sign bolted to the front gate with the number of their new corporate-approved towing vendor. I dialed the number. A dispatcher picked up on the second ring, but I gave him the address, the spot number, and the license plate of the Audi. I heard the rapid clacking of a keyboard on the other end. Then the dispatcher sighed. Yeah, buddy, I can't touch that vehicle. That plate is logged in our system under a permanent do not tow override from the property management group. If I tow it, we lose our contract. It's parked illegally in my privately leased spot, I said, my breath pluming in the freezing air. Take it up with management tomorrow, the dispatcher said flatly. Have a good night. The line went dead. I stood there in the freezing cold, staring at the black Audi. My chest was tight. My shoulders ached from the shoveling the night before. Sylvia had weaponized her position to steal my labor, knowing exactly who she was stealing it from, and she had built a system that protected her from the consequences. I walked back to my Camry. I didn't drive away. I pulled it forward and parked it perfectly parallel to her Audi, out in the cleared driving lane. I turned on my hazard lights. I went upstairs to my apartment. I didn't grab the cheap plastic snow shovel. I walked into my bathroom, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a heavy-duty 5-gallon plastic bucket I used for mopping. I filled it to the absolute brim with cold water from the bathtub faucet. I carried the heavy, sloshing bucket down the stairs, walked over to the grass median where I had piled all the snow the night before, and set it down. Then I went back upstairs and grabbed the shovel. I didn't damage her car. I didn't touch the paint. I didn't break a window. I just went to work. So I took a massive, heavy pile of dirty snow I had cleared the night before, and I started shoveling it right back. But I didn't just throw it in front of her car. I packed it. I built a solid wall of dense, freezing snow directly against her rear bumper. I packed it tight with the back of the shovel. Then I built another wall against her driver's side door, wedging the snow heavily against the door handle and the wheel wells. I worked in total silence. The only sound, the scraping of plastic on concrete and my own heavy breathing. It took me an hour to completely entomb the back half and driver's side of the Audi in a 3-foot-high barrier of densely packed snow. Then came the water. The temperature was currently 4 degrees Fahrenheit. I picked up the 5-gallon bucket and slowly, methodically poured the water over the snow walls I had just built. I let it soak deep into the packed snow, watching it instantly begin to crystallize and harden in the brutal cold. I went back upstairs. I refilled the bucket. I carried it down. I poured it again. I did this 6 times, 30 gallons of water. By the time I poured the last bucket, the snow barrier wasn't snow anymore. It was a solid, impenetrable, reinforced wall of dirty ice, fused directly to the asphalt and curving perfectly around her tires and doors. You couldn't have kicked your way through it with steel-toed boots. You would have needed a pickaxe and an hour of free time. I put my bucket and shovel in my trunk, got into my Camry, drove out to the main county road, found a spot on the dirt shoulder, and walked 15 minutes back to my apartment in the freezing wind. I didn't care. I felt completely warm inside. I set an alarm for 8 a.m. I usually sleep until noon, but I wasn't going to miss this. I woke up, made a cup of coffee, and stood at my sliding glass door, looking down at the carport through the blinds. At 8:45 a.m., Sylvia appeared. She was wearing a long wool coat, a thick scarf, and high-heeled leather boots. She was walking briskly, holding a steaming cup of coffee in a paper cup, clearly ready to get into her warm, preheated car and drive away. She rounded the corner of the building and stopped dead in her tracks. Even from the second floor, I could see the exact moment her brain short-circuited. She dropped her hand, spilling coffee onto the snow. She walked up to the Audi, her expensive boots slipping on the ice. She reached out and touched the solid ice wall blocking her driver's side door. She tried to kick it. Her boot bounced off the ice with a dull, hollow thud, and she stumbled backward, nearly falling. She walked around to the back of the car. She looked at the 3-foot glacier completely blocking her exhaust pipes and rear tires. She walked to the passenger side, which was technically clear, but parked so close to the structural wooden pillar of the carport that she couldn't open the door more than 4 inches. She was trapped. Her untouchable VIP vehicle was completely encased in a custom-built frozen tomb. She pulled out her her phone. She started pacing frantically, making phone calls. 10 minutes later, a maintenance guy in an Apex uniform walked up with a standard snow shovel. He took one look at the ice wall, swung his shovel at it, and the plastic head of the shovel instantly snapped in half against the frozen concrete. He threw the broken handle on the ground, shook his head, and walked away. Sylvia stood there in the freezing cold for another 40 minutes. She eventually had to trudge all the way out to the main road in her leather heels and wait for an Uber in the freezing wind. Her Audi sat frozen in spot 42 for 4 straight days. The ice was so solid they literally could not move it until the temperature finally broke the following week. For 4 days, every single resident who walked past the carports saw the regional director's car, humiliated and immobilized. When the ice finally thawed enough for them to chip it away with metal spades, she drove it off the property. She never parked in my spot again. In fact, she never parked on the property again. Whenever I saw her visiting the leasing office after that, she parked her Audi completely off-site, out on the dirt shoulder by the main road, and walked in. I bought a brand new, heavy-duty metal snow shovel the next week. I keep it in the trunk of my Camry, but I haven't had to use it once. Spot 42 is mine, summer or winter, rain or ice. And nobody, not entitled neighbors or corporate vice presidents, dares to touch it. Spring hit the city hard that year. The massive dirty snowbanks in the parking lot slowly collapsed into gray slush, then washed down the concrete storm drains, taking the winter grime with them. For 2 straight months, Spot 42 was a sacred, untouchable piece of real estate. Apex Residential had learned their lesson. And Sylvia never looked my way when I walked past the leasing office, and nobody parked in my spot. But corporations don't just absorb massive municipal fire fines and lost revenue without looking for a way to bleed it back out of someone else. They didn't go after my reserved spot again. They went after everyone. In early April, new metal signs went up at every entrance to the complex. They were matte black with aggressive blood-red lettering, patrolled 24/7 by Ironclad Recovery. Unauthorized vehicles towed at owner's expense. Ironclad wasn't like the old tow company Dave used to use. Dave's guy was just a tired dude with a flatbed who only showed up when you called him. Ironclad operated like a predatory paramilitary force. They drove massive, dark gray, lifted wreckers with totally blacked-out windows and low-profile light bars. They didn't wait for residents to call in complaints. They actively patrolled. They crept through the complex at 3 a.m. with their headlights off, using high-intensity spotlights to scan windshields. They were strictly commission-based, and they were hungry. Apex sent out another mass email to streamline the parking verification process. Every resident with a registered vehicle or a reserved spot was issued a new holographic silver sticker. The email was explicitly clear. The sticker had to be permanently affixed to the lower left corner of the driver's side windshield. Not taped, not sitting on the dashboard. Affixed. Any vehicle without a visible, properly mounted sticker would be removed without warning. I took 0 chances. The day I got my sticker from the front office, so I took a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a microfiber cloth out to my Camry. I scrubbed the inside glass until it squeaked. I peeled the backing off the holographic square, pressed it exactly 1 inch from the bottom and 1 inch from the side of the glass, and used the edge of a credit card to smooth out every single air bubble. It was perfect. It caught the light. You could see it from 20 feet away. I went back to my routine. Work, sleep, park in 42. The kitchen was gearing up for the brutal summer patio season. We were rolling out a new menu, which meant I was pulling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, training new line cooks who didn't know a spatula from a slotted spoon. I was surviving entirely on espresso shots and sheer willpower. It was a Tuesday morning. I had gotten off work at 2 a.m. the night before. I'm parked perfectly in my spot, locked the doors, and dragged myself upstairs. I woke up around 11 a.m. because I had to deposit a check at the bank before my afternoon shift. I put on my jeans, grabbed my keys, and walked down the stairs, already mentally calculating prep times for the dinner rush. I turned the corner of the building. Spot 42 was empty. My 10-year-old Toyota Camry was gone. There was just a rectangle of dry, sweeping asphalt and a few fresh dark drops of hydraulic fluid glistening in the morning sun. I didn't yell. I just stopped walking. My brain felt like it was wrapped in heavy cotton. I looked up and down the carport, thinking maybe in a state of absolute exhaustion I had somehow parked somewhere else, but I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I walked over to the black and red ironclad sign bolted to the pillar. I dialed the number. A dispatcher picked up on the first ring. It sounded like he was in a room full of people yelling over dispatch radios. Ironclad, I'm a resident at the Apex complex, I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. My Toyota Camry was towed from my privately leased reserved spot. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. License plate? I gave it to him. Yeah, we have it, the dispatcher said, chewing loudly on something. Towed at 3:45 a.m. Violation code is failure to display valid community permit. My permit is permanently glued to the glass, I said. Lower left corner, exactly where management mandated. Driver's report says no permit visible, he replied, entirely bored. Impound lot is at 400 Industrial Parkway. Drop fee is $485. We only take cash or certified cashier's check. I bring your ID and registration. Have a good one. He hung up. I ordered an Uber. I didn't have time to be furious. I had a kitchen to run in 3 hours. The impound lot was in a rotting industrial wasteland near the city rail yards. It was a massive dirt lot surrounded by 10-foot-high chain-link fencing topped with coiled razor wire. The office was a miserable, dusty trailer sitting on cinder blocks. The air outside smelled like diesel exhaust, rust, and cheap cigars. I walked up the wooden ramp and pulled open the heavy metal door. Inside, behind a thick sheet of scratched, smudged, bulletproof glass, sat a guy who looked like a bouncer at the world's worst nightclub. He had a thick neck, a tribal tattoo showing under the collar of his polo shirt, and a gold chain resting against his collarbone. His name tag said, Vince. I slid my driver's license under the metal slot in the counter. Toyota Camry, I said. Vince typed it in, printed out a single sheet of paper, and slid it back to me. It was an invoice for $485. Stapled to the back of it was a printed photograph. No permit, Vince grunted, not looking up from his monitor. Sign the bottom, pay the fee, and I'll pop the gate. I flipped the paper over and looked at the photo. It was a picture of my car, taken at night, illuminated by the harsh white glare of the tow truck's spotlight. It was a tight close-up of my windshield, and there was no permit visible. I stared at it. I knew for a physical fact that the holographic sticker was there. I had practically welded it to the glass. I leaned closer tailored to the cheap, grainy printout. The photo had been taken from a bizarre, highly specific, extreme downward angle. The tow driver hadn't stood in front of the car and taken a picture of the glass. He had stood directly beside the driver's side front tire, leaned heavily over the hood, and angled the camera perfectly so that the thick black metal arm of the windshield wiper blade completely eclipsed the 2-inch square of glass where the sticker was mounted. It was an intentional, manufactured blind spot. They weren't just aggressive, they were running an active, systematic fraud ring. "The sticker is right behind the wiper blade," I said, tapping the photo against the glass. "Your driver intentionally obscured it with the angle of the camera." Vince finally looked up. He gave me a look of pure practiced contempt. "Photo says no permit. System says no permit. If you got a problem with the tow, you pay the fee to get your property out of my lot and you take it up with your leasing office tomorrow. I don't do disputes, cash or check. I'm not paying you a dime," I said. Vince laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "Then your car sits here. It's an extra $60 a day for storage. Up to you, chef." He had seen my work pants and non-slip shoes. I didn't argue with him. Arguing with a guy behind bulletproof glass is a waste of oxygen. I took my phone out of my pocket. Ever since Brenda poured a bottle of cheap wine onto my patio, I had never taken down my discreet motion-activated Wi-Fi security camera. I had just angled it slightly higher so it captured not just the balcony above me, but the entire depth of Spot 42 and the driving lane behind it. It recorded in 1080p high definition with infrared night vision. Directly to a cloud server. I opened the app. I filtered the alerts to last night. I scrolled to exactly 3:40 a.m. I hit play. I stood there in the dusty, quiet trailer and watched the blacked-out ironclad wrecker back silently into the lane behind my Camry. I watched the driver step out. He was wearing a high-vis vest and holding a heavy flashlight. I watched him walk directly to the front of my car. I watched him shine the flashlight straight at my windshield. In the infrared video, the holographic sticker lit up like a beacon in the lower left corner. He clearly saw it. He stared right at it. Then, I watched the driver reach his hand out. He grabbed the heavy metal arm of my windshield wiper. He physically pulled it up, stretching the spring, and forcefully wedged the wiper blade diagonally upward across the glass, unlocking it into a completely unnatural position directly over the sticker. He stepped back, pulled out a digital camera, leaned over the hood, and snapped the exact photo Vince had just handed me. Then, he reached back, snapped the wiper blade down to its normal resting position, walked to the back of his rig, dropped the metal claws, and hooked my car. It was felony tampering with a vehicle in Grand Theft Auto, captured in crystal clear, undeniable high definition. I turned my phone's volume all the way up, pressed play again, and held the screen flat against the bulletproof glass, right at Vince's eye level. Vince looked at it. His jaw stopped chewing. The smug, bored expression completely evaporated from his face. He watched the driver manipulate the wiper blade. He watched the flash of the camera. He watched the theft. The video finished. The trailer was dead silent except for the hum of the cheap window AC unit. "I have State Statute 49-3.2 pulled up on my browser," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "It covers predatory towing, fraudulent impound, and falsifying photographic evidence. It carries a minimum $10,000 fine per incident and immediate suspension of your municipal operating license." Vince swallowed hard. He didn't say a word. "I'm going to walk out that metal door," I told him, looking him dead in the eyes. "I'm going to call the local police precinct and report my vehicle stolen. I'm going to email this 1080p video file to the desk sergeant, the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, and the investigative producer at Channel 7 News who loves doing segments on local scams." I paused. I let the silence hang there. "Or," I said softly, "you can press the button to open the gate, bring my car out here in the next 60 seconds, and hand me a receipt that says paid in full for $0. Your choice, Vince." Vince stared at me for 3 long seconds. He didn't posture. He didn't threaten me. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the end of his entire business model if that video went public. He slowly reached under the counter. A loud, metallic buzzer sounded, and the heavy chain-link gate outside began to roll open. He typed furiously on his keyboard, hit print, grabbed the paper, and shoved it through the metal slot. It was an invoice. The total due was $0. "Cars in row 4, he muttered, looking back down at his monitor. "Take it." I took the paper. I folded it neatly. I put it in my pocket and walked out into the dusty lot. I found my Camry exactly where he said it was. I inspected the bumper for damage, got in, started the engine, and drove out through the open gate without looking back. I made it to work with 30 minutes to spare. I prepped the line, checked the inventory, and ran a flawless dinner service. I never emailed the news station, but I absolutely emailed the video file directly to the regional vice president of Apex Residential the next morning. I didn't write a long, angry paragraph. I just attached the video, the $0 invoice, and a single sentence. "If an ironclad truck touches my car again, my lawyer will draft a class action lawsuit." 3 days later, I pulled into the complex after my shift. The massive black and red ironclad signs were gone. They had been unbolted and removed from every pillar and gate. In their place were the old, familiar, faded blue signs for Dave's tired local towing guy. I drove past them, turned the corner, and pulled directly into Spot 42. I turned off the engine, grabbed my bag, and walked upstairs. It has been 2 years since that day. Brenda is a distant memory. Sylvia got transferred to a different district. Ironclad is out of business. Every night, when the kitchen is scrubbed clean and my legs feel like dead weight, I drive back to the complex. I bypass the crowded, chaotic overflow lots where people are still circling like sharks. I coast toward my building. I look at the bright white 42 painted on the concrete. I pull in. I lock my doors, and I go to sleep. 2 years. And that was the longest stretch of uninterrupted peace I had ever experienced in that complex. For 24 months, my life was a simple, beautiful loop. I went to the restaurant, I cooked thousands of pounds of food, I came home smelling like a deep fryer, and I parked in Spot 42. I didn't have to think about it. The massive, brilliant white 42 painted on the asphalt felt like a permanent shield. Then Apex Residential decided to run a new promotional campaign. They called it the Hometown Heroes Initiative. They offered a massive 20% monthly rent discount to active duty city police officers and firefighters if they signed a 2-year lease. Management claimed it was to build community relations and increase security. In reality, they just wanted to use marked police police cruisers as free visual deterrence so they could fire their overnight private security patrol and save a few grand a month. Within a month, 3 cops moved into my building alone. One of them was a guy named Officer Greg Carter. Carter was a patrol sergeant. He was built like a brick wall, kept his head shaved, completely bald, and walked with that slow, heavy swagger of a guy who is entirely used to people getting out of his way. Because he was a sergeant, he didn't share a pool car at the precinct. He was issued a take-home vehicle, a massive, brand-new Ford Explorer Police Interceptor, completely decked out with the push bumper, heavy-duty suspension, and the low-profile roof light bar. Carter lived on the 3rd floor. My spot, spot 42, which is located directly at the bottom of the 3rd floor stairwell. It was a Thursday night. We had just survived a brutal dinner service where the AC in the kitchen broke down. It was 115 degrees on the line. I was severely dehydrated. My head was pounding, and my non-slip shoes felt like they were filled with wet cement. I pulled into the complex at 1:45 a.m. I rounded the corner. Sitting in spot 42, dominating the entire space, was the Ford Explorer Interceptor. The moonlight caught the reflective police decals on the doors. I hit the brakes. My chest tightened. I had fought entitled neighbors. I had fought corporate management. I had fought predatory tow companies. But staring at a marked police cruiser illegally parked in my private spot was a completely different kind of wall. I didn't honk. I didn't get out and yell. I put my Camry in park, pulled out my phone, and called Dave's old tow guy, the one who had rightfully reclaimed the complex contract. A familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, towing." "Hey," I said. "I need a tow at the Apex complex. Spot 42. Someone is parked in my reserved spot. Be there in 15, he said. I waited in my car, idling in the fire lane. 15 minutes later, the battered yellow flatbed rolled into the carport. The driver hopped out holding his clipboard. He walked to the back of the Ford Explorer to check the plates. He stopped. He shined his heavy mag light on the bumper, then slowly panned the beam up to the light bar, then to the municipal city plates. He lowered the flashlight, turned around, and walked straight back to his truck. I rolled down my window. "Hey, what are you doing? It's right there!" The tow driver leaned against my doorframe. He looked exhausted and deeply apologetic. "Listen to me, Chef. I will tow a Bentley. I will tow a mob boss's Cadillac. I will not, under any circumstances, hook a marked city police cruiser. If I tow that car, the precinct will flag my company's plates. Every single time my trucks leave the yard, we will get pulled over for random safety inspections. They will bleed my business dry in a month. I'm sorry, I'm not touching it." He got back in his truck and drove away. I was completely alone. I couldn't tow him. I couldn't call the police on the police. I had to park on the dirt shoulder of the county road again and walk a mile in the dark. The next morning, I woke up early. I walked downstairs at 10 a.m. and waited by the bottom of the stairwell. At 10:15, I heard the heavy thud of tactical boots on the wooden steps. Officer Carter came walking down, fully dressed in his patrol uniform, his heavy-duty belt creaking with every step. "Excuse me," I said, stepping into his path. He stopped. He looked me up and down, immediately falling into that guarded, assessing cop stance. "Can I help you?" "You're parked in spot 42, I said, keeping my voice calm and perfectly level. "That's a privately leased, reserved spot. I pay for it monthly. My lease addendum guarantees it. I need you to move your cruiser to an unassigned spot." Carter didn't apologize. He didn't look embarrassed. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Management told me I could park the Interceptor wherever it provides the best tactical visibility for the courtyard," he said, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt right next to his radio. "Spot 42 gives me a clear sightline. It's a community safety measure. It's my leased property," I corrected him. "You can't seize it for convenience." Carter leaned in just a fraction of an inch. He dropped his voice, stripping away the public servant tone. "Listen to me, buddy. I'm a sworn officer of the law. I work violent crimes. When my radio goes off, I don't have time to jog across a dark parking lot. I need my vehicle, so I'm parking it right there. If you've got a problem with the logistics, go talk to the girls in the leasing office, but do not approach me off duty again. Are we clear?" He brushed past me, got into the Interceptor, and drove off. I went straight to the leasing office. Musilvia's replacement was a young guy named Kyle, who looked like he was fresh out of business school. I explained the situation and showed him my lease. Kyle nervously adjusted his collar. "Look, man, we're getting a massive insurance break by having him park that cruiser in a highly visible area. He specifically requested that spot because it's under the carport lighting. I can offer you a different reserved spot on the other side of the property." "I don't live on the other side of the property," I said. "I live right here. Enforce the lease." "I can't tow a police car," Kyle stammered. "My hands are tied." I walked out. The rules didn't apply to Carter, and the people meant to enforce them were either terrified of him or profiting off him. 2 days later, the real intimidation started. I was driving to work at 1 p.m. I pulled out of the complex gates and merged onto the county road. I wasn't speeding. My registration was current. Suddenly, the blinding flash of red and blue LED lights erupted in my rearview mirror. A siren gave 2 short, aggressive chirps. It was a Ford Explorer Interceptor. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs. I put the car in park, rolled down all my windows, and kept my hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I watched the side mirror. Officer Carter walked slowly up to my window. He didn't ask for my license and registration. He just leaned his heavy arms on my door sill and looked down at me behind his dark sunglasses. "You swerve back there," Carter said. His tone was casual, almost conversational. Looked a little erratic. "You been drinking today?" Chef, I haven't had a drop of alcohol," I said, staring straight ahead. "I'm going to work." "Right, work." Carter tapped his heavy tactical flashlight against the roof of my Camry. Tap, tap, tap. "You know, driving is a privilege. Lots of hazards on the road. Tires get slashed by debris. Taillights get broken. Sometimes cars get impounded for unpaid parking tickets in the city database. It's a stressful world out there. A smart guy just keeps his head down, goes to work, and doesn't cause unnecessary problems for the people trying to keep his neighborhood safe." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling heavily of stale coffee. "You're a smart guy, aren't you?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Good." Carter patted the roof of my car. "Drive safe and enjoy the walk tonight." He walked back to his cruiser and drove away. I sat on the side of the road for 10 minutes. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, pure, concentrated rage. He had just used the authority of the state to physically detain me on a public road purely to threaten me over a parking spot. He was daring me to fight him, knowing he had a badge, a gun, and a union to back him up. And I had a spatula and a stained apron. I didn't yell. I didn't hit my steering wheel. I merged back onto the road and drove to the restaurant. I spent the next 3 nights parking on the dirt shoulder. Every night I walked past my spot, and every night his interceptor was sitting there. But I wasn't just walking, I was planning. I knew complaining to his precinct captain would do nothing. Cops protect cops. So a verbal complaint about a parking spot would be thrown in the trash before I even left the lobby. I needed something undeniable. I needed paper. I needed liability. On my next day off, I didn't sleep. I sat at my computer and pulled up the official municipal code for the city's police department, specifically the heavily regulated section on the Take-Home Fleet Vehicle Program. I read 50 pages of dry, bureaucratic legal text until I found it. Section 8, paragraph 4. Municipal police vehicles operated under the Take-Home Program are the strict liability of the city. As such, they must be parked in a legally authorized, secure location at the officer's registered primary residence. Officers are strictly prohibited from storing municipal vehicles on private, leased, and/or rented property belonging to a third party without the explicit, documented, and notarized consent of the leaseholder. The city's insurance underwriter required that clause. If a city vehicle is parked illegally on private property and gets vandalized, or leaks oil and causes environmental damage, the city can be sued, and the insurance company will refuse to pay out because the officer violated the storage protocol. Carter wasn't just breaking my lease. He was breaking the strict liability contract of his own department's motor pool. I went to my patio. My hidden security camera was still running perfectly. I pulled the memory card and downloaded the last 2 weeks of footage. I had crystal clear, time-stamped video of Carter's cruiser parked in spot 42 every single night, but I needed the final nail in the coffin. I needed proof of the intimidation. I bought a high-quality, discrete dash cam that recorded interior and exterior audio. I mounted it tightly behind my rearview mirror, completely out of sight. Then, I intentionally parked in spot 42. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I pulled into the spot, locked my car, and went upstairs to my apartment. I sat on my couch and waited. At 4 p.m., Carter came home. I watched from my blinds. He drove his personal car, a sleek lifted truck, into the lot, planning to swap vehicles. He saw my Camry in the spot. He slammed his truck into park in the fire lane, stormed out, and started pounding his fists on my apartment door. I opened the door, my phone already recording audio in my pocket. "Move your piece of shit car right now," Carter snarled, stepping aggressively into my doorway. And he was in his civilian clothes, but he had his badge clipped to his belt and his sidearm holstered. "That's my leased spot," I said. "I don't give a fuck about your lease," Carter yelled, the veins in his neck bulging. "I'm a sergeant with the police department. I told you that spot is mine. I told you what happens if you cause problems. You want me to run your plates right now? You want me to find a reason to drag you out of here in handcuffs? Because I will." "You're threatening to arrest me over a private parking spot?" I asked clearly, making sure the phone microphone picked it up. "I'm promising you," Carter said, poking his thick finger hard into my chest. "Move the car, or I'm calling a flatbed and impounding it as an abandoned vehicle in a police operation zone." I didn't argue. I held my hands up, walked downstairs, and moved my car to the street. He immediately pulled his interceptor into spot 42. I went back upstairs. I stopped the recording. I had everything. I had the municipal code violation. I had the time-stamped videos of the cruiser trespassing. I had the audio of a sworn officer explicitly threatening to falsify an arrest and illegally impound my vehicle using his badge as leverage. I didn't take it to the local precinct. I bypassed them completely. I compiled everything onto a heavy-duty encrypted flash drive. I drafted a 3-page letter. I didn't frame it as a parking dispute. I framed it in the exact legal terminology that terrifies city bureaucrats: deprivation of rights under color of law, official misconduct, and willful violation of municipal liability insurance protocols. I addressed one copy to the chief of the Internal Affairs Bureau downtown. I addressed the second copy to the city manager's office, specifically the risk management director who handles city insurance policies. I sent both packages via certified mail with signature confirmation required. Then I waited. 4 days went by. Carter kept parking in the spot. He kept glaring at me whenever we crossed paths in the courtyard. On the 5th day, I was prepping a massive batch of hollandaise sauce in the kitchen when my cell phone rang. It was an unknown 800 number. I stepped into the walk-in cooler to take a call. "Am I speaking with the resident of Unit 114 at the Apex Complex?" a stern, formal voice asked. "You are," I said. "This is Lieutenant Davis with the Office of Internal Affairs. I am calling regarding the materials you submitted to the Risk Management Division and our office. I assume you reviewed the audio," I said. There was a long pause on the other end. Cops hate civilians who fight back with a paper trail, but they hate liability lawsuits even more. "The department takes allegations of official misconduct very seriously," Lieutenant Davis said carefully, choosing every word like he was reading from a script. "We have reviewed the footage and the audio recording. I am calling to inform you that the issue regarding the unauthorized storage of a municipal vehicle on your leased property has been permanently resolved. The department apologizes for the inconvenience." He hung up. I finished my shift. I was incredibly anxious driving home. I didn't know if Carter was going to be waiting for me with a crowbar or if he was going to pull me over and actually drag me out of the car. I pulled into the complex at 2 a.m. I rounded the corner. Spot 42 was empty, but it wasn't just empty. Parked out by the dumpsters in the uncovered, unlit overflow lot, right where Brenda's Mercedes used to sit, was Carter's personal lifted truck. The Interceptor was entirely gone. The next morning, I walked out to throw my trash away. Carter was walking out of the building. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. He looked tired. He looked smaller. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He kept his eyes glued to the pavement, walked all the way out to the dumpsters, got into his personal truck, and drove away. I found out later from one of the other cops in the building what had happened. Internal Affairs didn't just tell him to move his car. They hauled him downtown, played the audio of him threatening a citizen with false arrest, and completely stripped him of his take-home vehicle privileges. They suspended him for 2 weeks without pay for conduct unbecoming, and permanently revoked his sergeant status. He had to ride the bus to the precinct to pick up a pool car like a rookie. He broke his lease and moved out of the complex a month later. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just took my trash to the dumpster, walked back to my building, and looked at the bright white 42 painted on the asphalt. It was just a piece of concrete, just a 10 by 20 rectangle of old oil-stained ground. But as I stood there in the morning light, I feeling the permanent ache in my lower back, I knew exactly what it was worth. It was worth fighting for, and nobody, not ever again, was going to take it from me.